Neighbors can be frustrating, but nothing compares to the chaos of a controlling Karen who thinks the world owes her everything. She wanted my pristine beachfront view, demanded I give it up, and even tried to use the HOA to pressure me into compliance. But little did she know, her greed and arrogance would backfire spectacularly, leaving her with nothing more than a smelly, worthless landfill instead of the paradise she craved. This is the story of how one entitled neighbor's obsession destroyed her own dreams. I realized Karen had a problem with my beachfront view. It wasn't because of anything she said directly. It was because of the way she stared. Her house was positioned 2 lots down from mine, close enough that we often ran into each other during neighborhood walks, yet far enough that our properties didn't touch. Unlike mine, however, her house wasn't situated right at the front of the development where the ocean breeze rolled in and the sunrise painted the waves gold every morning. My place had been one of the first built, positioned on the prime strip of sand that everyone else envied. Karen's, on the other hand, was built later, wedged slightly inland, with a view that was more of her neighbor's fence than the shoreline. From the very beginning, I noticed the longing in her eyes every time she visited or passed by my yard. When friends came over for a beach bonfire, I'd see Karen lingering across the street, pretending to water her plants or adjust her mailbox, all while glancing in the direction of my fire pit. When I hosted a small family barbecue, Karen would find an excuse to come by, sometimes with a neighborhood welcome basket, sometimes with a complaint about smoke or parking. Though her real intention was obvious, she wanted to peek at what she didn't have. At first, I brushed it off. Everyone wants the best view. It's human nature. But Karen's interest wasn't casual. It grew into something sharper, almost obsessive. I'd catch her pausing in front of my property, eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line, as though she was calculating something. It wasn't admiration anymore. It was resentment. Karen's personality reveals itself. Karen had quickly developed a reputation in the neighborhood. Even before her feud with me escalated, most people already considered her the unofficial HOA hawk. She was the kind of person who walked around with a clipboard during community meetings, writing down infractions real or imagined. If a trash bin was left out past collection day, Karen noticed. If a lawn grew higher than 3 inches, Karen reported it. If Christmas lights stayed up in January, Karen emailed the board demanding fines. People joked about her, but nobody laughed to her face. That was part of Karen's power. She thrived on intimidation. If she complained enough, most residents caved just to avoid her wrath. She was a master at manipulating rules, often citing obscure HOA regulations nobody else bothered to memorize. And now, that laser focus had landed on me. The first confrontation. The first direct confrontation happened on a quiet Sunday morning. I was sitting on my back deck, sipping coffee, watching the waves roll in. It was one of those serene moments where the only sounds were the distant seagulls and the gentle lap of water against sand. That peace shattered when I heard the clack of sandals against the wooden stairs leading to my yard. Karen didn't knock. She simply appeared at the edge of my deck, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "You know," she began without a greeting, "it is really unfair that you've monopolized the best view in this entire community." I blinked, unsure if she was serious. "Excuse me?" Karen gestured toward the horizon, where the sun had just started climbing into the sky, casting streaks of orange and pink across the water. The whole community should be able to enjoy it equally, don't you think?" I set my coffee down, already feeling my patience thin. "Karen, everyone can walk to the beach. There's public access right down the road." "That's not the same," she snapped. "Your property blocks mine. Do you know what I see when I look out my window, the back of your fence? And when you host parties out here, it feels like you're rubbing it in." Her words hung heavy in the air. I almost laughed, thinking it was some kind of bizarre joke, but the stern set of her jaw told me she was dead serious. "Karen," I said carefully, "I bought this house because of the view. I worked for years to afford it. I'm not going to apologize for enjoying what I paid for." Her eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." Then she turned and left, her sandals slapping the deck with deliberate force. The whisper campaign. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing subtle changes. Neighbors who used to wave at me grew more reserved. People who regularly joined my beach gatherings suddenly declined invitations. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but then I overheard a conversation at the community mailbox that confirmed my suspicion. Karen was talking to Mrs. Peters, a kindly older woman from 3 houses down. "It's just so selfish," Karen was saying. "He flaunts that view like it's his personal trophy, and all of us are stuck with nothing. I've heard he even broke some HOA landscaping guidelines, but I'll have to look into that more closely." Mrs. Peters mumbled something I couldn't hear, but Karen continued, lowering her voice. "Don't worry. I'll handle it. People like him think they can ignore the rules, but the HOA exists for a reason." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself not to march over and confront her right there. I knew Karen thrived on public drama. Giving her an audience would only fuel her fire. Instead, I quietly collected my mail and walked home. But the encounter left a sour taste in my mouth. The escalation. Karen's tactics escalated quickly. First came the formal complaints. I received 3 separate violation notices from the HOA within a single month. One accused me of having unauthorized outdoor lighting, string lights ID hung around my deck for evening dinners. Another cited my improperly stored watercraft, even though my kayak was neatly racked against the side of my house, exactly where the bylaws allowed. The third claimed my landscaping included non-native plants, which was laughable because I'd hired the HOA-approved landscaping company to do the work. Each time I had to submit evidence, photographs, and lengthy written responses to prove my innocence. It was exhausting, but I refused to let Karen win. Then came the harassment. Karen started walking her dog past my house multiple times a day, lingering by my fence as if inspecting it for flaws. She took photos of my yard, sometimes with her phone angled, so obviously I wondered if she even cared that I saw. On more than one occasion, I caught her standing on tiptoe, peering over the fence into my backyard. The final straw came when I found her standing directly on my property one evening. I was bringing out trash when I spotted her in the corner of my yard, staring out toward the beach. "Karen!" I snapped, marching toward her. "What the hell are you doing here?" She didn't flinch. Instead, she gave me a smug smile. "Just admiring the view. You don't deserve it, you know. Someone like me could appreciate it much more." My fists tightened around the trash bag I was holding. "Get off my property, now." She took her time leaving, her dog tugging impatiently on its leash. Just before stepping onto the sidewalk, she glanced over her shoulder. "Enjoy it while you can. Things are about to change." My realization. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the rhythmic crash of waves outside my window, a sound that normally soothed me but now carried an edge of anxiety. Karen wasn't just jealous anymore. She was plotting. The warning in her voice, the smugness in her smile, all of it pointed to something bigger than petty complaints. I replayed our interactions in my mind, trying to piece together her plan. Was she rallying the HOA against me? Was she trying to push for rezoning? Or was she simply trying to wear me down until I left? One thing became crystal clear. Karen's obsession with my beachfront view wasn't going to fade. It was growing, consuming her like a fire that refused to die out. And if I didn't prepare myself, she would do everything in her power to take what wasn't hers. What Karen didn't realize, however, was that I wasn't the type to back down. I hadn't fought for years to afford this property just to let an entitled neighbor bully me into giving it up. If she wanted a war, I would give her one, but on my terms. For now, though, I had to wait. and watch, and make sure that every move Karen made would eventually come back to haunt her. Because while she was obsessed with my view of the ocean, I was beginning to see something she couldn't see, her downfall slowly forming like a storm on the horizon. The HOA power play. The shift from Karen's quiet bitterness to her outright war against me didn't take long. By the time the first official letter from the Homeowners Association arrived, I already knew she was behind it. Still, holding the crisp white envelope in my hands gave her vendetta a whole new weight. It was no longer just petty glares or whispered gossip. It was the HOA, a governing body with power over fines, penalties, and property values. And Karen, as everyone in the neighborhood knew, had the board's ear. The letter accused me of multiple violations of community guidelines, specifically citing my string lights, my kayak, and my landscaping, the very same issues Karen had already grumbled about in passing. The tone was clinical, almost sterile, but I could feel Karen's fingerprints all over the words. It was exactly her style, formal, weaponized, and designed to intimidate. The first HOA meeting I attended, the next HOA meeting, determined to defend myself. The board gathered in the community clubhouse, a bland beige room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs arranged in neat rows. At the front sat the three board members, Mr. Franklin, the HOA president, Mrs. Gomez, the treasurer, and of course Karen, who had finagled her way onto the board last year after badgering half the neighborhood into voting for her. The moment I walked in, Karen's lips curled into a smug smile. She was already shuffling through a folder so thick it looked like a legal brief. "We'll start with item 4 on the agenda," Mr. Franklin announced, tapping a pen against the table. "Property violations at Lot 12. Lot 12, my house." Karen immediately straightened in her seat. "I'd like to present evidence." She slid a stack of photographs across the table. Grainy, poorly lit shots of my backyard, my kayak, my deck lights. Each one clearly taken from outside my property, sometimes through gaps in the fence. I clenched my fists, furious at the invasion of privacy, but I forced myself to stay calm. "These lights," Karen said sharply, tapping one photo, "are not compliant with Section 3, Article 7 of our community guidelines. They are a fire hazard, not to mention a nuisance to neighboring homes." Mr. Franklin glanced at the photo, then at me. "Do you have a response?" "Yes," I said firmly. "Those lights are outdoor rated, energy efficient, and installed by a licensed contractor. They've been there for months with no issues." Karen cut in before I could continue. "That's not the point. The rules clearly state all exterior modifications must be approved by the board before installation. He never submitted a request." I looked directly at her. "Because it's decorative lighting, not structural modification. The guidelines don't require approval for this." The room grew tense. Mrs. Gomez, who often tried to play peacemaker, cleared her throat. "Let's table this for now. We'll review the bylaws and make a determination." But Karen wasn't finished. She pulled out another photo, this one of my kayak. "And here we have an unauthorized watercraft stored in plain sight. Our community rules specify that all boats must be stored in a garage or designated facility. He has it propped up on his side yard." I leaned forward. "That is not true." Karen had mastered the art of twisting vague regulations into weapons. If I hosted a family gathering, she filed a noise complaint. If I left my trash bins out for 10 minutes longer than usual, she reported me. If a single weed sprouted in my flower bed, she photographed it and emailed the board. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, all orchestrated through the HOA. What made it worse was how easily Karen manipulated others. At meetings, she spoke with an air of authority, quoting sections of the bylaws as if she'd written them herself. She framed her crusade not as a personal vendetta, but as a noble defense of community standards. And while most people saw through her pettiness, few had the courage to challenge her outright. The false allegations. Things escalated to a dangerous level when Karen began spreading outright lies. One afternoon, a certified letter arrived at my door stating that I was under investigation for operating a short-term rental business without authorization. I almost laughed out loud at the absurdity. I had never once rented out my home, not even to friends. But when I asked around, I discovered Karen had been telling people she'd seen strangers coming and going from my property. She twisted the fact that I occasionally hosted visiting relatives into evidence of an illegal rental scheme. I attended yet another HOA hearing to dispute the charge. Karen stood confidently before the board, arms folded, her voice dripping with false concern. "I'm only trying to protect the neighborhood," she said sweetly. "Short-term rentals bring crime, noise, and lower property values. I've seen multiple unfamiliar cars parked in his driveway at odd hours. It's clear what's happening." I stood, barely containing my anger. Those were my cousins, visiting from out of state. I can provide proof. Copies of their IDs, photos from family gatherings, even travel itineraries. This accusation is baseless. Karen smirked. "Isn't it suspicious how quickly he has all that documentation ready?" The board murmured, shifting uncomfortably. That was the moment I realized Karen's game wasn't just about technical violations. It was about painting me as the villain, the selfish neighbor who thought he was above the rules. If she could tarnish my reputation, she knew the board would eventually break me down with enough fines, enough stress, enough pressure to make me leave. Cracks in the facade. But Karen made one mistake. She underestimated my resolve. Instead of backing down, I doubled down. I started attending every meeting, arriving early, bringing my own copies of the bylaws, highlighting sections she conveniently ignored. I called out her exaggerations, calmly and clearly, in front of everyone. At first, the board tried to dismiss the tension, but slowly I noticed a shift. Mrs. Gomez, once hesitant, began asking Karen more pointed questions. Mr. Franklin, who usually deferred to her, started rubbing his temples whenever she launched into one of her tirades. Even a few neighbors began whispering after meetings, muttering about how far Karen was taking things. The cracks in her facade were forming. Still, Karen pressed harder. She filed new complaints weekly, each one more absurd than the last. My mailbox leaned half an inch too far left. My deck furniture wasn't uniform in color. My dog barked excessively, a lie, considering I didn't even own a dog. It was harassment, plain and simple, and though the board was beginning to see through her act, the process was slow, painfully slow. The breaking point. The true breaking point came on a stormy night in late spring. Rain pelted the windows, the ocean roared like a beast, and I was settling in with a book when headlights flashed outside my window. I stepped onto the porch just in time to see Karen, umbrella in one hand, camera in the other, snapping photos of my deck in the pouring rain. "What are you doing?" I shouted over the storm. She didn't even flinch. "Documenting violations," she yelled back, her voice carrying through the downpour. "Your deck furniture isn't secured properly. It could become a hazard." I couldn't believe it. In the middle of a thunderstorm, she was out here risking her safety just to collect evidence against me. That was when it hit me fully. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about obsession. Karen wanted my beachfront view so badly she was willing to drown herself in paperwork, lies, and even the rain to make it happen. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before her obsession destroyed her completely. My plan for payback. Karen's obsession had reached a fever pitch. She was no longer content with complaints or HOA violation letters. She wanted me gone, stripped of the view she believed was rightfully hers. And while she hid behind the board and the bylaws, I began to realize something important. Her arrogance made her sloppy. For months, I had been on the defensive, replying to letters, proving my compliance, and fending off rumors. But one night, as I sat on my deck staring at the calm waves rolling in, I decided I'd had enough. It was time to stop reacting and start planning. Gathering the evidence. The first step was patience. If Karen wanted to play her game through the HOA, I would play mine through proof. I bought a set of discreet security cameras and positioned them carefully around my property. One at the front porch, one overlooking the side yard, and another angled toward the deck and fence line. I didn't install them to spy on neighbors. I had no interest in what anyone else was doing. They were there for one reason, to document Karen. It didn't take long for them to pay off. Within a week, I had hours of footage showing her standing on tiptoe, peering over my fence, snapping pictures of my deck, and even stepping onto my property more than once. She always thought she was being clever, but the cameras didn't lie. Every trespass, every intrusion, every petty inspection was caught in clear detail. Watching the footage, I felt both vindicated and furious. This wasn't just neighborly irritation anymore. Karen was violating my privacy, and I finally had proof. Learning her weakness. Still, I knew evidence alone wouldn't stop her. Karen thrived on control, but she also thrived on reputation. In HOA meetings, she played the part of the righteous enforcer, the guardian of community standards. She needed people to see her as a leader, as the one protecting property values and rules. But what would happen if that mask slipped? I began asking questions, subtle ones, nothing that would make it obvious. Over coffee with neighbors during casual chats by the mailbox, I let conversations drift toward Karen. And what I heard confirmed my suspicions. People were tired of her. She knocked on my door because my recycling bin was on the curb too early, one neighbor sighed. She told me my lawn chairs weren't the right color, another said, rolling his eyes. I just keep my head down so she doesn't bother me, whispered Mrs. Peters. Everyone had a story. Everyone had been harassed. But no one wanted to stand up to her alone. That was her power. Divide and conquer. If I could show them who Karen really was, if I could pull away the curtain of her fake authority, the neighborhood would turn against her. And without their support, the HOA board wouldn't back her either. Setting the trap one evening, I reviewed my growing library of camera footage. There she was again, standing in the rain with her umbrella, snapping photos of my supposedly unsafe deck furniture. Another clip showed her dog trampling across my flower bed while she leaned over my fence to get a better look at my grill. Each video was a nail in her coffin. But I wanted more. I wanted undeniable proof of her hypocrisy, something that would shatter her reputation in one blow. That opportunity came faster than I expected. Late one Friday night, just after 11 p.m., my cameras caught Karen sneaking out to the curb. She was dragging her trash bin into the street, the full 12 hours earlier than the HOA guidelines allowed. Normally, I wouldn't have cared. Who hasn't put the trash out a little early? But Karen had fined me, for leaving my bin out 15 minutes late once. Now, here she was, blatantly breaking the very rules she weaponized against everyone else. I saved the footage, smiling to myself. Hypocrisy was Karen's Achilles heel. The meeting. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, I was ready. I arrived early, folder in hand, just as Karen strutted in with her usual stack of evidence against me. She barely glanced my way, too busy whispering with Mr. Franklin about serious community concerns. When the agenda reached my property violations, Karen stood, brimming with confidence. She presented new photos, accusing me of unauthorized gatherings on my deck and claiming my kayak was still in violation. Her voice was smooth, rehearsed, dripping with false authority. When she finished, Mr. Franklin turned to me. "Do you have a response?" "Yes," I said, standing slowly. "In fact, I do. But before I address her claims, I think the board should see something important." I pulled out a USB drive and handed it to Mrs. Gomez, who plugged it into the projector. The screen flickered to life, showing clear, time-stamped footage of Karen stepping onto my property, leaning over my fence and snapping photos in the pouring rain. The room went silent. Then came the kicker, the clip of Karen rolling her trash bin to the curb at 11:06 p.m., complete with her glancing around to make sure no one saw. Gasps rippled through the room. Even Mr. Franklin raised his eyebrows. "This," I said firmly, "is the person accusing me of constant violations, trespassing on my property, harassing me, and breaking the very rules she claims to uphold. If we're going to talk about community standards, maybe we should start with the person enforcing them." The fallout. Karen's face turned crimson. "That footage it's an invasion of privacy," she sputtered. "No," I said calmly. "It's my property, my cameras, my right to protect my home." Mrs. Gomez leaned forward. "Karen, this is very troubling. Trespassing, taking unauthorized photos, and the trash bin." She shook her head. "This doesn't reflect well on the board." For once, Karen was speechless. The smug confidence had drained from her face, replaced by a tight, panicked expression. She opened her mouth to argue, but the murmurs from the audience drowned her out. Neighbors exchanged knowing looks. Some even smirked. They finally saw what I had seen all along. Karen wasn't a guardian of rules. She was a hypocrite. The turning tide. That night marked a shift. The HOA didn't fine her, and not yet. But the damage was done. Neighbors stopped nodding along to her rants. The board grew less receptive to her complaints. And when she glared at me, it no longer carried the same weight. For the first time since the battle began, I felt the tide turning in my favor. But what Karen didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that I wasn't done. The footage was only part of my plan. Her downfall had only just begun, and the best part was still ahead, because Karen had spent months obsessing over my beachfront view. But soon, she'd find herself staring at something else entirely, something far uglier and far more permanent. A landfill. Karen's landfill nightmare. Karen had always believed she could bend the neighborhood, and even the HOA itself, to her will. For months, she had been relentless. The complaints, the fines, the false accusations, the endless crusade to strip me of my property and claim the view she believed she deserved. And though the tide had shifted after I exposed her hypocrisy at the meeting, she wasn't finished. She never was. The more her influence over the board waned, the more desperate she became. Instead of quieting down, she doubled her efforts, hammering on about how my property ruined the uniform aesthetic of the community and brought down values. But her arguments didn't stick anymore. The neighbors, once cowed into silence, had started to push back. They remembered their own run-ins with her, the harassment, the nitpicking. They saw now what I had seen from the beginning. Karen-S obsession wasn't about rules or values. It was about control. And when she lost that control, she began to unravel. The petition. Her next move was her boldest yet. Karen began circulating a petition to rezone my property, to declare the beachfront strip a communal area instead of a private lot. It was a ridiculous idea, one that had no legal standing, but that didn't stop her. She went door to door, clipboard in hand, speaking in her honeyed, persuasive voice. "Don't you think it's unfair that one person monopolizes the view?" she told Mrs. Peters, who later recounted the story to me. This would be a space for everyone. Picnics, bonfires, sunsets. Imagine how lovely it would be without one person hogging it all. Most people listened politely, but few signed. Some even shut their doors in her face. The more she pressed, the more resistance she met. And with every refusal, her frustration grew. I knew she was reaching her breaking point. The land deal. That's when fate intervened. Not far from our neighborhood, just beyond the tree line, there was a stretch of land that had sat vacant for years. Developers had once planned to build a second phase of homes there, but environmental restrictions and poor soil quality had stalled the project indefinitely. It was worthless land, swampy, unstable, and prone to flooding. For as long as I'd lived there, it had been an eyesore, overgrown with weeds and littered with debris from old construction. Rumors had circulated that the county planned to purchase it for a landfill site. Most of us ignored the gossip. It wasn't close enough to affect our properties. But one person in particular had her eyes on it, Karen. Desperate to maintain her image of influence, she started bragging at meetings about how she was negotiating to buy that land herself. She claimed she'd turn it into a private extension of her home, a community garden. She said that would make her property more valuable and show the rest of us how to be responsible landowners. But the truth? Karen wanted that plot because it bordered directly behind my house. If she controlled it, she thought she could pressure the HOA to grant her easements or at least leverage her ownership to force restrictions on me. It was her last power play. The twist of fate. But Karen didn't do her homework. While she was scrambling to pull funds and boast about her big purchase, the county finalized its plans. The land had already been marked for acquisition. Not as a garden, not as a community park, but as a fully operational landfill. The announcement came in the form of a public notice mailed to every resident in the area. I still remember the moment I opened the envelope, scanning the words twice before the realization sank in. A landfill. Right behind Karen's house. When I attended the community meeting about the project, I couldn't help but notice Karen's absence. For the first time, she was silent. The aftermath. Within weeks, surveyors arrived, marking the boundaries with bright orange stakes. Heavy machinery rumbled in not long after, tearing through the weeds and leveling the ground. The sound of drills and bulldozers echoed through the neighborhood for days. Karen's once smug face was nowhere to be seen. The woman who used to march around with her clipboard now pulled her curtains shut, avoiding eye contact with neighbors. Her grand plan to expand her influence had backfired spectacularly. Instead of a lush garden or a communal paradise, she was stuck with the stench and noise of trucks hauling in waste, day after day. Her prized dream home, which she had once lorded over the neighborhood, plummeted in value. Realtors whispered about how impossible it would be to sell. And the best part? From my deck, I still had the same breathtaking ocean view I'd always cherished. Karen, on the other hand, couldn't step outside without smelling rotting garbage on the wind. The irony. Neighbors began to joke quietly about the irony. "Karen wanted your view," one said with a smirk. "Guess she got hers. The view of a landfill." Fitting, isn't it? Another laughed. All that trash for someone who spent her life stirring it. I never joined in the mockery, and at least not openly. But inside, I couldn't help but feel satisfaction. For months, she had made my life miserable, tried to weaponize the HOA, and nearly succeeded in turning the community against me. Now, her empire had crumbled, undone not by me but by her own greed and short-sightedness. Closing the chapter one evening, I sat on my deck, the sunset painting the horizon in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The salty air was fresh, the waves calm, the view as perfect as ever. I lifted my glass in a silent toast, not to Karen, but to the peace I had fought so hard to protect. Behind me, the distant rumble of landfill trucks carried through the air. a reminder of Karen's downfall. She had demanded my beachfront view, but fate had given her something else entirely. Not the ocean, not the sunset, not the paradise she craved, a landfill, and in the end, it suited her perfectly.